Hello everyone. Today I will be discussing a very famous and notorious female serial killer known as Aileen Wuornos. She was born on February 29th, 1956, and between the years of 1989 and 1990, she was a street prostitute along the highways in Florida, and she was also convicted for shooting dead and robbing 7 of her male clients. She claimed that her victims had either raped her or attempted to rape her, and that the homicides she committed were in self-defense. She was sentenced to death for 6 of the murders and was executed in 2002 after spending more than 10 years in Florida's death row. For Aileen's early life, she was born in Rochester, Michigan, which is a suburb of Detroit, and her mother, Diane Wuornos, was 14 when she married her Aileen's father, Leo Pittman, who was 18 years old. Wuornos had never met her father. In 1967, her father was sentenced to life imprisonment for kidnapping and raping a 7-year-old girl. He was a schizophrenic, and he committed suicide by hanging in prison in January 30th, 1969. When Aileen was only 4 years old, her mother abandoned her and her older brother Keith, who was born in 1955, and she was left them with their maternal grandparents, Lori and Britta Wuornos, who legally adopted them both, and they were both alcoholics. Aileen had been subjected to a life of, not so good things. For example, by the age of 11, she was engaging in sexual activity at school for exchange for drugs, food, cigarettes, things like that. And she also engaged in sexual activity with her brother. Later on, she would claim that her grandfather had sexually assaulted her and beaten her when she was a child. She was pregnant at age 14 in 1970 after being raped by a family friend, and she gave birth to the boy to a baby boy at a home for unwed mothers on March 23rd, 1971, and the child was placed up for adoption. A few months after her son was born, she dropped out of school, and at the same time, her grandmother had died from liver failure. When she was 15, her grandfather had threw her out of the house, and she was forced to live in the woods near her old home, and she was supporting herself through prostitution. She has had many run-ins with the law and a lot of early criminal activity. For example, on May 27th, 1947, when she was only 18 years old, she was arrested in Jefferson County, Colorado, for driving under the influence. She got a DUI for disorderly conduct and for firing a .22 from a moving vehicle. And later on, a little bit after that, she was charged with failure to appear in court. She has had many instances like this. When she was about 20 years old, she had hitchhiked to Florida, and she met a 69-year-old yacht club president named Louis Gratz Fell. They had got married, and their the announcement of their nuptials was printed in the local newspaper society pages. So everyone knew about their marriage, and everybody knew about Aileen and how she was not living a very good life. She constantly got involved in altercations and confrontations at their local bar, and she went to jail briefly for assault. She also hit her husband with his own cane, which led to him to getting a restraining order against her within the weeks of the marriage. And then she ended up returning back to Michigan, where she was originally from, and she was arrested at the Brandy's Club in Mansalona, Antrim County, and charged with assault and disturbing the peace for throwing a cue ball at a bartender's head. She has had many different instances like this throughout her, early life before leading to her series of murders. She did meet, when she was 30 years old, she did meet a 24-year-old named Tyra Moore, and Tyra Moore was a motel maid at a gay bar in Daytona Beach called the Zodiac. They had moved in together, and Aileen was supporting them with her earnings as a prostitute. And another example of her violent encounters with, the law and things like that. She was questioned regarding an incident in which they were accused of assault and battery with a beer bottle. Her and Tyra Moore. Those were very few examples of the many run-ins, violent run-ins she's had with the law and others. But here are the series of her, more serious crimes, her murders, which led her to be named a notorious female serial killer. One of her first murders was the murder of Richard Charles Mallory. Wuornos had claimed that Mallory beat and raped her and sodomized her after he drove to an abandoned area for sexual services. He was her first victim, and she claimed to have killed him in self-defense. Later, it became known that Mallory had previously been convicted of attempted rape in Maryland. Aileen made no mention of this until she stood trial, and Moore never claimed she mentioned it to her. 3 days after the murder, a Volusia County deputy sheriff found Mallory's abandoned vehicle, and on December 13th, his body was found several miles away in a wooded area, and he had been shot several times. 2 bullets to the left lung were left to have been the cause of death. Her second murder was a man named Andrew David Spears. He was a construction worker, and he was declared missing on May 19, 1990. On June 1st, 1990, his naked body was found along US 19 in Citrus County, and he had been shot 6 times with a .22. Her third victim, Charles Edmund Carskadden, he was 40, and he was a rodeo worker, and he had been shot 9 times with a .22. His body had been wrapped in electric blanket and was badly decomposing when he was found. Witnesses saw Wuornos in possession of Carskadden's car, and Wuornos had also pawned a gun identified to be belonging to him. Her fourth victim, Peter Abram Symes, he was 65, and he was a retired merchant seaman. On July 4th, 1990, his car was found in Orange Springs, Florida, and Moore and Wuornos were seen abandoning his car, and Wuornos' handprint was found on the interior door handle, and his body was never to be found, sadly. Her fifth victim, Troy Eugene Burris, he was 50, and he was a sausage salesman from Ocala, Florida. On July 31st, in 1990, he was reported missing, and on August 4th, 1990, his body was found in a wooded area along State Road 19 in Marion County, and he had been shot twice. Her sixth victim was Charles Richard Dick Humphreys. He was age 56, and he was a retired United States Air Force major and a former state child abuse investigator and a former chief of police. On September 12, 1990, his body was found in Marion County. He was fully clothed, and he had been shot 7 times in the head and torso, and his car was found in Zah'nye County. And her last victim, before she was convicted, was Walter Gino Antonio. He was 61, and he was a trucker, a security guard, and a reserve police officer. And on November 19, 1990, Antonio's nearly naked body was found near a remote logging road in Dixie County, and he had been shot 4 times, and 5 days later, his car was found in Brevard County. On July 4th, 1990, Wuornos and Tyra abandoned victim Peter Symes' car after they were involved in an accident. Rhonda Bailey, who had witnessed the accident, provided police with a description of the 2 women, which later led to a media campaign to locate them. Police had found some of the victims' belongings in pawn shops. Wuornos' fingerprints that was on the receipt at one of the pawn shops matched the print that was left in his car. And Wuornos had a criminal record already in Florida, and samples of her prints were in a database. On January 9th, 1991, she was arrested at the Last Resort Biker Bar in Volusia County on the pretext of an outstanding warrant in the name of Lori Grotty. Police located Moore the next day in Pittston, Pennsylvania, and she agreed to elicit a confession from Wuornos in exchange for immunity from prosecution. On January 14th, 1992, Wuornos went to trial for the murder of Richard Charles Mallory. All the previous convictions were normally inadmissible in criminal trials under Florida's Williams rule. The prosecution was allowed to introduce evidence related to her other crimes to show a pattern of illegal activity. On January 27th, 1992, Wuornos was convicted of the murder of Mallory's with the help of Moore's testimony. After sentencing, psychiatrists for the defense testified that Wuornos was mentally stable and diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and 4 days later, she was sentenced to death. On March 31st, 1992, Wuornos pleaded no contest to the murder of Charles Richard Humphreys, Troy Eugene Burris, and David Andrew Spears, saying that she wanted to get right with God. In her statement to the court, she said in part, "I want to confess to you that Richard Mallory did violently rape me, as I told you, but these others did not. They only began to start to." On May 15, 1992, Wuornos was given 3 more death sentences. In June 1992, Wuornos pleaded guilty to the murder of Charles Edmund Carskadden. In November 1992, she received her 5th death sentence. And in February 1993, she pleaded guilty to the murder of Walter Gino Antonio and was sentenced to death again. No charges were brought against her for the murder of Peter Abram Symes, as his body was never found. In all, Wuornos received 6 death sentences. Most of her stories were inconsistent, and she claimed initially that all 7 men had either raped her or attempted to rape her while she was working as a prostitute, but later recanted the self-claiming defense, citing robbery and desire to leave no witnesses as the reason of murder. During an interview with the documentarian Nick Broomfield, when Wuornos thought the cameras were off, she told him that it was, in fact, self-defense, but she could not stand being on death row, where she had been for 10 years at that point and wanted to die. Wuornos' execution by lethal injection took place on October 9, 2002, and she declined a last meal, which could have been anything under $20, and opted for a cup of coffee instead. And her last words were, "Yes, I would just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back. The Independence Day with Jesus." June 6, like the movie, Big Mothership and all, I'll be back. I'll be back. She died at 9:47 a.m., and she was the 2nd woman in Florida and the 10th in the United States to be executed since the 1976 United States Supreme Court decision restoring capital punishment. After her death, her body was cremated and her ashes were scattered beneath a tree in her native Michigan by Wuornos' childhood friend, Don Botkins. At Wuornos' request, Natalie Merchant's song Carnival from her album Tiger Lily from 1955 was played at her funeral. She spent many hours listening to this album on death row, and when Merchant found out about this, she gave permission to use the song in the closing credits of Nick Broomfield's documentary Aileen, Life and Death of a Serial Killer. And that concludes my discussion on Aileen Wuornos and her life, her crimes, and all she was subjected to. Thank you for listening.